My brothers and sisters in the Lord, a few years ago, the Mensa Group was holding their convention in San Francisco, California. And the Mensa Group is a group of individuals who have an IQ of 140 or greater. So very intelligent individuals. And at this particular convention, a few of the members went out for lunch. And as they were eating there at the cafe, they noticed something that was odd on the table. On their table, they noticed that the salt was in the pepper shaker and the pepper was in the salt shaker. And so this brought about a conversation of these very intelligent individuals, and they decided that they were going to come up with a solution of how they were going to get the salt into the proper shaker and the pepper into the proper shaker without spilling any of the contents, and only using the instruments that were at their disposal at the table. And so they discussed all their plans and all their ideas, and they had a solution. And after they came up with the solution, it was going to involve a napkin, a straw, and an empty saucer. So they wanted to impress someone with this big solution. So they called the waitress over. And they said to the waitress, "Ma'am, we noticed that there's a problem here. The salt is in the pepper shaker and the pepper is in the salt shaker." And without missing a beat, my brothers and sisters, that woman simply apologized to them. She unscrewed the two caps, she switched them over, and she said, "Will that be one check or separate checks, gentlemen?" My brothers and sisters, sometimes common sense is worth more than an IQ of 140. But I tell you that story because I want to speak to you about the image of the salt shaker. Now, you may ask why. We just heard the conclusion of St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 9. But the only thing is that in the Gospel today, it left out the last two verses of chapter 9. And this is how the last two verses of the Gospel today ends. It's called the simile of salt. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt becomes insipid, if it loses its saltiness, with what will restore its flavor? You see, my brothers and sisters, salt was an image that the people that Jesus spoke to could relate to, because salt was a very important commodity in the time of Jesus. And for anything that is a commodity, my brothers and sisters, anything that we use, once it no longer serves its effective purpose, there's no reason to keep it. If salt loses its saltiness, then what good is it? It should be thrown out or trampled underfoot. And in the time of Jesus, as many of you well know, salt had two essential purposes. One was to add flavor to food, and two, it was an essential preservative. And it remained a essential preservative in human history all the way up into modern refrigeration. But those two characteristics of salt, my brothers and sisters, are very important for you and for me. Because we are called to be salt to the earth. We are called to come out of the salt shaker and into the world. And what does that mean, or what does that look like as followers of the Lord Jesus? Well, let's take the first use of salt. The first use of salt is to be a flavoring, to enhance flavor, to bring out flavor. My brothers and sisters, as disciples of the Lord Jesus, you and I are called to bring flavor to the world, just as Jesus brought flavor to the world. Because there's nothing worse, my friends, especially if you grew up in New Orleans, than food that has not been salted properly. There's nothing worse, my dear friends, than a Christian who doesn't live out their faith. We are called to bring flavor to the world. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Because oftentimes, my friends, we find ourselves in a state of life that is not very flavorable. And what could that look like? I remember reading some years ago, a woman was writing to Ann Landers. And the letter went something like this. She was saying about how she had a wonderful husband, and she had wonderful children, and she had a wonderful home, and she had this and she had that. But she said her life was just bland. And her words were, it was like a stew. She wasn't from New Orleans. It was like a stew without salt. My brothers and sisters, sometimes our life needs flavor. And we're called to bring the same flavor to life that Jesus brought to life. Because it says in John 10:10, I have come so that you may have life and have it more abundantly. What does that mean, my friends? It means that life has meaning. You know, one historian said one time that history is only one damn thing after another. Now, that is not a Christian worldview. That is not a Christian worldview. But how many times we fall into that, where life is just one thing after another. It's boring, it's bland. I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, I'm scared, whatever it may be. I don't find joy, I don't find hope. It's because, my brothers and sisters, you and I are called to bring flavor to life, not only to our own lives, but to the lives of those around us. And how do we bring flavor to life? Certainly there are many ways as followers of the Lord Jesus, but one essential way is how we care for one another. You notice how in the gospel how Jesus cared for people? Certainly he didn't allow them to stay in their sin, and he taught them the truth, but he also cared for them in charity. By healing the sick, by casting out those who are possessed by demons, by feeding the hungry, by forgiving sins, by welcoming to the kingdom those who are outcast. You see, my brothers and sisters, how do you and I care for people? It's one of the ways we bring flavor into the world. I remember in these days, my brothers and sisters, since Hurricane Ida has hit, we've had many people, and there may be people in this church right now who are still hurting, who are still trying to figure out all the answers to the problems that they face. And I remember, my brothers and sisters, not long after that, in meeting people and speaking to people, one of the essential ways to care for people in times of need is to be able to listen to their story. To be able to listen to their story. And one of the essential ways to be able to care for people is we may not have the answer that they need. We may not be able to solve the problem, but we can listen to their story. And sometimes the best thing that we can offer someone is a hug, a touch, the touch of the Lord, adding flavor to life. And I know, my brothers and sisters, because of COVID, you can't touch anything, can't touch anyone. But guess what, my brothers and sisters? Sometimes in life, the best thing that you can do as a follower of the Lord Jesus is to hug somebody. And maybe you're sitting there right now in the pew thinking someone needs to hug me because I need it at this moment. Adding flavor to life. Bringing the salt out of the salt shaker and into the world. And the second thing, my brothers and sisters, of course, is we know that salt was always used as a natural preservative. For the people of Jesus' time and for many, many decades and centuries later. To preserve, because there was no refrigeration. In fact, salt was a very important commodity for that. The Roman soldiers, part of their income, part of what they were given in payment, was given in salt. It's where we get the word salary. Where we get the word salary. In parts of Africa, people paid their debt with salt cakes because it's a very important commodity, because it was used as a preservative for food. My brothers and sisters, as followers of the Lord Jesus, how are you and I called to be a preservative in the world? What are we called to preserve? One of the things we're called to preserve, my dear friends, is the good news of the gospel. We're called to preserve He who is the way, the truth, and the life, and we're called to pass it on to the next generation. We're called to preserve the good news of the gospel and pass it on to our children and our grandchildren, or maybe our great-grandchildren, our neighbor across the street, our co-worker, our friend who is suffering, the individual who's gone down the wrong path. We're called to preserve the good news. And we do that, my brothers and sisters, by our witness, not necessarily by our words, by our witness, to be able to be prophetic. Look at the first reading. Moses says, don't be jealous of those people because they got a portion of the Spirit. If only all people could be prophets, could have the prophetic voice, to be that preservative in the world, to bring forth the good news, to be that witness. Some years ago, I remember seeing the commercial. It was for MasterCard. It went something like this. Playing on the golf course, $136. New clubs, $800 and something. Lunch at the clubhouse, $46. Balls and tees, $12. Hitting a hole in one with a witness, priceless. My brothers and sisters, that's the priceless part. Because certainly, my dear friends, if I hit a hole in one, I would want a witness because nobody would believe it. My brothers and sisters, the important part of life and being that preservative is that we're called to witness to the faith. We're called to witness to the good news. And we're called to go out into the world to be the disciple that the Lord Jesus calls us to be. And so, my dear friends, as we gather around the altar this day, let us just think of that image of salt and the salt shaker. And we have to get out of the salt shaker and into the world. We have to get out of the salt shaker and into individuals' lives. We've got to get out of just simply living our faith in the church building or the church house or here around the sanctuary and living it and professing it and being a witness to the good news by how we live our everyday lives. Because when we do that, my friends, then and only then will we be able to bring the good news of the gospel to a world that desperately needs to hear the message of the Lord, to a world that desperately needs to feel the message of the Lord, to a world that desperately needs healing and reconciliation and peace, to be able to bring it to people's lives. You see, my friends, to preserve the good news means that you and I are called to witness, to be able to say to the person next to you, neighbor, I got this far by faith. To give your testimony of what God has done for you. And then, my brothers and sisters, be willing to listen to the story of another person. Because you see, my friends, I can guarantee you, because I've seen it so many times in my own life and in the lives of those I've ministered to. Your story, whether it be your story today or your story from 20 years ago, your story, my dear friends, and the way you've overcome by faith in the Lord Jesus and with His help and His grace, that is going to become the survival guide for someone else. I don't know who, I don't know when, but your story, by preserving the good news, will become someone else's survival guide on the journey. My brothers and sisters, it's time to get out of the salt shaker and into the world.